John Payton shocked Broncos country after he took Pat Bryant in round 3 of the 2025 NFL draft. But we'll tell you why Pat Bryant is a seamless fit inside of his offense here on day one on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos country? Happy Cinco de Mayo. Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everyone in Broncos country, all the everydayers out there who make us your first listen of the day every single day. However you choose to do so. If you're not yet an everydayer, it's easy to become one. Hit that subscribe or that follow button, and you'll never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team for all the best Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day all year long. This is the place to be. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com.
Our rookie profile series continues here as we recap the 2025 NFL draft class here for the Broncos. It's going to lead us all the way up into this weekend's rookie minicamp. Today's focus is Pat Bryant, wide receiver out of Illinois in the third round. We'll talk about where he is placed on the depth chart right now going into the season, if we had to project it based on where he went in terms of positional value. And on top of that, we'll highlight some of his strengths as a blocker, as a route runner, and what he does when the ball is in his hand. But we'll also highlight, is the 4.61 40-yard dash, is that really a legitimate concern? We're going to get all that and much more on today's episode of the show. Sayre, let's dive into it here. Obviously, Broncos country, we've done these player profile series. If you missed our episode on R.J. Harvey from last week, go check it out. Then we did one on Jahdae Barron as well. You can check all that out wherever you get your podcast. But Pat Bryant is the focus today. And Sayre, look, you and I reacted to the NFL draft live as it was happening. We did episodes here. Broncos country, this seems like the one pick that a lot of people initially were like, what are the Broncos doing? But I also think a lot of the people I've seen some negative comments about, they've kind of changed their tune a little bit on Pat Bryant after they've actually had a chance to put on the tape and watch some film.
Yeah, the guy's good. He can play, right? He's got a lot of good qualities about him, whether you're talking about, his strong hands or just the different nuances of the wide receiver position that he really excels at. And I know we're going to get into his strengths here in a bit too, but really, when you look at this Broncos wide receiver room, it's pretty fascinating that this is kind of the only move they have made all offseason, right? We know they added Trent Sherfield, but Trent Sherfield was added to play special teams, not necessarily to rotate in the wide receiver group unless there's an emergency. And we certainly hope that there's not any sort of emergency situations this year. So Pat Bryant is really the only competition that guys like Devon Vele and Troy Franklin are getting this offseason. We think that Courtland Sutton and Marvin Mims are probably going to be the top two guys on the depth chart once again for the Denver Broncos this coming season. But as we saw last year, it was Vele who was third on the team in targets. Now, Evan Ingram complicates everything with the target share, doesn't he? I mean, because the Broncos will now have a legitimate threat at that position to be able to take a reasonably large share of the targets this season. It's going to be interesting to see where Pat Bryant fits into that mix, because he's an outside first type of guy who I think could play inside, but he's more of an outside receiver. To me, Cody, based on what we saw last year, I feel like he's kind of a direct threat to maybe Troy Franklin more so than anybody else.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Honestly, I disagree, Sarah. I think he's more of a threat to Devon Vele than he is Troy Franklin, just because of usage. But I think there's value to be had here with Vele, with Pat Bryant, with Troy Franklin. I mean, with Marvin Mims. Sarah, you and I were talking about it. I mean, when we were doing our mock drafts, kind of pounding the table for a wide receiver in round number 1 of the NFL draft, the argument was like, all right, hey, you have a room where you have a proven guy in Courtland Sutton who's trending towards an extension, but you're also in the boat where what if you have an injury at that position to one guy or two guys? What does that room look like? And there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of guys who are still developing. They're in that process there. Well, now you add a guy like Pat Bryant in the mix. And, I'm glad that you brought up Evan Ingram, because I've seen some irresponsible takes on social media as of late saying that Evan Ingram isn't a joker and that he's more of a receiver. That's not necessarily the case. He's going to line up in line. He's going to line up, as an offset wing. He's going to line up in the slot. He's going to line up on the outside. But that's not, I think, going to take away anything from the wide receiver room, right? Because those positions are entirely different. And Sean's plan with, we talked about R.J. Harvey with the running back position and the tight end position. he wants to be able to take advantage of matchups in the middle of the field. When you face defenses that have that too high shell, he wants to attack those inside linebackers in the passing game in different ways, and those guys give him flexibility. Pat Bryant, to me, is going to probably be the guy that I think is going to challenge Devon Vele, right? You lose Lil Jordan Humphrey in NFL free agency. Well, who plays Lil Jordan's role here? I think Devon Vele, by snaps last year, you look at the prototype, certainly fit the mold of that. I think Pat Bryant is a guy who can also push Vele as well. While Vele's going to have the upper hand going into training camp in the preseason because of his experience, his spot isn't necessarily safe, though I do think when it's all said and done, he will be on the 53-man roster. And I think the Broncos are going to have really good depth at wide receiver. I think it's paramount that they do that. But Pat Bryant, I think we could see him pushing for playing time right away. You mentioned Cortland Sutton, Marvin Mims. Those are the top two guys. Pat Bryant is going to, I think, thrive in that role player type of role where he can play in the slot. He can play on the outside as that big Z. We'll obviously get into his strengths here in a little bit. But, man, you look at his production, obviously at Illinois, which when you think of Illinois, you don't really think of great quarterback performances, though I did catch some flack on Twitter. I said something about the Rutgers game where I was just like, man, I was so mad for Pat Bryant because in that game, his quarterback is just missing throws left and right. Well, apparently, you don't see this on the All-22, but a lot of Illinois fans were chiming in saying, did you not know about the wind that day? No, I don't know. They don't show it on the All-22, but apparently the wind was really bad. And so that's a big reason why. But obviously the Illinois quarterback is a talented young guy, but I was frustrated by watching the game without knowing the context of that. Sayre last year, 54 total catches, 984 yards, and 10 total touchdowns there. He's averaging 18.2 yards per catch here. But it's not just that. They even used him as a rusher, 5 rushing attempts for 14 yards. So that tells me he could be a player that you can use on jet motions. So you use a guy with size, he could be a lead blocker out of that. You can use Marvin Mims in different ways as well. This just adds another dynamic to the Broncos wide receiving core, which I feel like it is desperately needed.
It does, and it's something that this team has to. Sean Payton's always going to find ways to get guys on the field, right? He is always looking for different personnel groupings to use. He's always looking to rotate guys. You're almost never going to see the same group of guys out there twice during a game. I know that's not necessarily true, but I think if Sean could make that happen over the course of a game, he probably would try because, he loves to use those different personnel groupings and to put guys in different spots to keep defenses guessing. Pat Bryant is the type of guy that I feel like you can isolate him in one-on-one coverage. I feel like when you are facing zone-heavy teams, this is like a baseball lineup where you're facing a guy, a pitcher who's really good against left-handed bats, but not against right-handed bats. And you want to load up the lineup with right-handed bats, right? I feel like Pat Bryant, especially against zone coverage, is going to be one of the Broncos' better receivers on the roster because you can see he has a great feel for beating zone coverage, for sitting down in those soft spots, and for coming back to the ball and working back to the quarterback. I feel like he's going to get a lot of usage this season. I don't know how consistent it's going to be. Hopefully, the Broncos are able to find some sort of semblance of consistency at wide receiver because last year there wasn't really anything. It was, stretches from Cortland Sutton, stretches from Marvin Mims, stretches from Vele, from Franklin. There was nothing really that you could rely on every single week. I feel like Pat Bryant kind of gives you, at least in terms of his skill set, he gives you a guy that you should be able to rely on him to do the same things well all the time. And that is a really strong quality of his, Cody, that I feel like is going to vault him up the depth chart rather quickly in his rookie year.
I think right now on paper, at least, right? And everything's got a formula. Look, we're not coming out here, Broncos country, not coming out here and crowning this, that, or the other, but we're saying like, these are the things that we see. These are the things that we know that Sean Payton has mentioned that he likes about guys. But Sayre, I also see a player in Bryant who maybe this might be the wide receiver on the Broncos. I know he made the comparison to Michael Thomas. I always think it's crazy to get into comping players. Right? There's certain things like size, the way that maybe your physical is a blocker that reminds you of somebody, right? But the comp, I think, is going to be something that people are going to use and be like, oh, he doesn't look like Michael Thomas as a rookie. This is a bust pick. Like, you see some of those things come back to bite you in the narrative. I do think he probably gives the Broncos the one consistent guy, wide receiver, I feel like can be effective with the slant route. We haven't seen too many slants here since Sean Payton has come to Denver. We are hoping to see more slants with Cortland Sutton. I feel like you can with Vele, but I feel like Pat Bryant, this is where you can actually bring the slant back to life inside of this offense, whether it be inside the slot, whether that be on the outside. I think that's going to be something we see here with him. But obviously, we're highlighting some of the strengths here. of Bryant and his mix here inside the Broncos offense. But we'll tell you why his catch focus is probably the biggest strength here for him going into this season. We'll break that down and much more in today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by Upwork. Scaling your business, it requires the right expertise at the right time. And with Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more. Experts that are ready to help you take your business to the next level. And Upwork gives businesses flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. So whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable.
And look, Sarah, when you're trying to hire for your business, you want to make sure that you find the right talent that's going to get the job done right. You have something in marketing that you need done. Well, get the best marketing expert that is out there. Upwork can connect you with a freelance expert who delivered incredible results right away. Plus, it's got cost-effective growth. Instead of hiring full-time, Upwork helps find affordable, top-tier freelancers to scale my business or your business efficiently. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com to connect with top talent and grow your business today.
Well, after struggling considerably last year in the drops department, the Denver Broncos went out and got a guy in this year's NFL draft, had one drop on 78 targets last season, and strong hands are one of just a number of strengths that Pat Bryant, the Broncos' third-round pick, brings to the table. Cody and I are going to tell you a little bit more about what you should love about his game on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But Broncos Country, want to say thank you to all of you that make us your first listen of the day every single day. You know your boys Cody and Sayre will have you covered every day throughout the course of the offseason with something, anything that's going on with your favorite team, the Denver Broncos. So if you haven't already done so, hit subscribe and don't miss a single episode of the show. Let's talk about strengths for Pat Bryant, Cody. I think the biggest thing that stands out to me when watching him, and it's more than just the statistical production here, but one drop on 78 targets last season, you see when you watch this guy play the strong, soft hands that just reliable. When you throw it in his vicinity, he comes down with it. He catches the ball away from his body. He makes ridiculous catches look easy. He catches through contact. He does all of these sorts of things that I think was desperately missing from last year's receiver group.
Well, and he's clutch too. I mean, Sarah, he's got 3 game-winning catches last season. The one against Rutgers was crazy because I believe that was 4th and 15, and he just did work, yards after the catch there. And I thought that was a fantastic play. I think there was a game, if I'm not mistaken, against Purdue, where I think he caught a game winner in overtime. I know he also caught a pretty crazy pass against Nebraska. Shout out to our friend Cam. I know he's reliving that game every single day. But my thought on Pat Bryant is just, you get that clutch factor. And you talked about it, Sarah. You nailed it to open up the start of this segment here, is that the Broncos had issues last year with drops with their receivers. Look, Cortland Sutton led the team in drops. Granted, he had the higher volume of targets. That's natural. I think when you look at any wide receiver one on any team, look at Jamar Chase, look at Justin Jefferson, look at the amount of drops that those guys have collectively as well because of the volume in which they're being targeted. But you look at a player who had 78 targets and only 1 catch, Sarah, that's productive. That's efficient. And what do we talk about? What hurt the Broncos in that playoff game against the Buffalo Bills? Cortland had a big drop in that game. Troy had a big touchdown catch, but he also had a drop later on in that game. Devon Bailey had 2 or 3 drops that were crucial. Marvin, you didn't have that worry about Marvin. Marvin came in clutch for you. He caught a 4th down pass from a punter in that game here, but you need more consistency from that group, and drops were certainly an issue last year. Heck, we were even talking about Josh Reynolds early on in the season against Seattle. Remember, he had the easy drop on a 3rd down on an out route that could have given the Broncos life in week 1. Bo Nix threw a great ball to him, and he dropped it. Lil Jordan Humphreys had a couple of key drops as well last season. So really, this is something that the Broncos, I think internally, they view as needing to upgrade in their department of the wide receiver room reliability. Now, you get that, but I also think you get that 6'3" size, Sarah. I mean, you see how fast he plays in space. So this is going to obviously go into maybe the weakness, the perceived weakness that people are talking about. But I also think he's explosive within the catch point, right? When he's running his routes, whether it's at 0 to 10 to 0 to 15 yards, if he's in breaking or out breaking, once he gets the ball in his hands or he makes a move, he's a great route runner. I don't think people are talking about that enough. He runs very clean routes and he's got some bend to it as well. That I think is a strength that nobody is highlighting here about Pat Bryant, that when I went through and I watched the All-22, which I got some film reviews on him coming out this week on Mile High Sports YouTube, that's one thing that stood out to me. And I don't think it's being talked about enough.
I'm excited to see your film reviews there, Cody, because I feel like just in the amount of time that we've had since processing this draft selection, there's really only a couple of folks out there that have truly broken down his game. And I find that fascinating because this guy was obviously extremely productive at Illinois. And with, let's just be honest, it was a shaky quarterback situation at best. And I think that you have plenty of examples of that when the wind is not swirling around the stadium. So I think this is a guy that you look at the hand-eye coordination and then the ability to keep his body under control when he's closing in on the sideline or when you got to make the toe drag swag types of plays. He's very adept with that. He's so good in those types of situations. So when you combine strong hands with great hand-eye coordination and being able to come down with those tight plays, hey, you got to go walk the tightrope here. You got to go make a ridiculous play for your quarterback. This is the type of guy that's going to do it. And I know that people call this hyperbole, but you got to remember when you're making some player comparisons, like some of these guys coming out of college were scrutinized for a lot of the same things. Like I know Amon-Ra St. Brown posted almost this exact same RAS score as Pat Bryant. And when you talk about some of their skills and some of their strengths coming out of the college level, other than the fact that I think Amon-Ra was a lot more proficient from the slot, and that's where he's worked really well in the NFL, I feel like there's a lot of qualities that they possess that are similar in nature. Like Amon-Ra ran a 4.61, but he's one of the best receivers in the NFL after the catch. He figures it out, right? He manages to make it happen. He's so tough. That's another thing that the Broncos love about Pat Bryant, his toughness. You heard George Paton, Sean Payton talk about the toughness. The guy can block, which is a prerequisite because they're going to try to run to the perimeter. They're going to try to get guys out in space. They're going to throw screen passes. You have to be able to block if you're a wide receiver for Sean Payton. And so there's just so much to like about his game, Cody. I can't wait to see your film review because I don't know. I mean, you don't see the lack of 40-yard dash time really on tape. He ran a 19.1 miles per hour at the gauntlet at the combine. So I don't know, game speed, play speed, it doesn't seem to be a problem.
I mean, it's always different too. And we always talk about this. Like even before the combine, we talk about players' 40-yard dash times. People get so enamored. Oh, this guy ran a 4.35. Okay, great. What can he do? When he's running across the field, like, we're talking about straight line speed. It's rare in a sense that we ever see a player, unless, he's running a fade and he beats the corner where he's just running straight line for 60, 70, sometimes 80 yards or even 40 yards. Like it's hard when you factor in how NFL defenses try to compress the field in today's game. Can you capitalize on the inner workings? I think you mentioned, obviously the strength that he has. I think his body control as well when he's adjusting to routes are great. I see the back shoulder throw being a big benefit to him this upcoming season. I also see his ability to throttle down quickly on curls and hitches, dig routes. I think this is going to be an area that's going to be a strength of him. But also the high effort. You watch him on tape, even when there's a pass play that's going to the other side, right? But he's got press coverage on the other side. He's running a guy off in the run game, when he's playing press because, hey, these big guys, you want to jam them at the line of scrimmage. You don't want them to get a free release. The fact that teams were playing press coverage on him quite a bit in college, knowing even though he wasn't the fastest long speed type of guy, I think that says a lot about how they viewed him in their film study there. Because ideally, if you feel like a guy's slow, guess what, Sayre? You don't got to press. You don't have to press the guy at all. You can play inside leverage. You can play head-up coverage, 5 to 6 yards off the ball, backpedal T-step, if you're into that thing these days, and break on the football if you're so worried about it. Instead, he was a guy that teams would consistently press. He'd win press man situations, but it's just the high-effort stuff on top of everything else that you're getting as a willing blocker, a guy who's tough, a guy who's a great route runner, that the Broncos are getting a really, really good player here. And look, you're not bringing Pat Bryant in to be wide receiver one. That's the point I've been trying to tell people. This is a move where he very well could be in 2 years, 3 years from now. He maybe even as a rookie, right? I think it's a stretch as a rookie. But in 2 years, he could be your wide receiver 2 in terms of you need 2 guys who are reliable on the outside. Well, you got Cortland on one. got Pat Bryant on the other, and then you got your speed guys like Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin who are going to factor in the mix heavily. And then you got Evan Ingram at the tight end position who's going to be that move around piece. On paper right now, this is a big boost to what the Broncos offense wants to do. And I think getting Bo Nix, a player like this, I think these two are going to have a very good connection here early on. But we're going to have to wait and see. You have to get on the field, put the pads on, training camp, preseason, all that. That's where it's all going to matter here, Broncos country. But until then, we can only tell you what we're seeing and why the Broncos made this pick. But let's get into some of the weaknesses here about Pat Bryant. People are saying 4.61 40-yard dash. That's a problem. We'll tell you why it's not here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. They say if you run a 4.6 40-yard dash that you are a good pick in the NFL draft. Well, I think history has shown that that's actually a lie. You can run a 4.6 40-yard dash and still be productive at the NFL level. It just depends on what your role is on the offense. We're getting to some of the weaknesses that people are talking about as it pertains to Pat Bryant here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Real quick, I want to say thank you once again, everyone in Broncos country, all the everydayers out there. We appreciate you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so, as we continue our rookie profile series here on the show throughout the remainder of this week, leading us into Broncos rookie minicamp. We're going to get coverage and recap. I'll be at those practices, and then we're starting to get ready for OTAs, minicamp, all that exciting stuff, and then training camp will be here. Broncos country football is right around the corner, so make sure you're rocking with us every single day, all year long. Sayre, let's get into some of the perceived weaknesses here about Pat Bryant. I think the number one thing that I see when people talk about Pat Bryant, right? You and I, we just highlighted the strengths. I've mentioned this so much. I've seen you do the same thing on social media, but the number one reply I always see people say, well, he ran a 4.61 40-yard dash. Miss me with that nonsense. That doesn't matter. That it drives me nuts.
Yeah, it does me too, Cody. I think because you can't write a player off based on 40-yard dash. You know, if that was the case, then there'd be a lot of players out there that, well, they probably shouldn't be playing today, and yet they're playing at a very high level. We already mentioned Amon-Ra St. Brown. I know Mike Thomas, he ran a 4.57, I think, something like that. So we're talking about 0.04 of a second difference. And that's, I mean, that can be a lot if you're talking about the Olympics, but when it comes to the NFL, it matters way more what you're doing on the field and how fast you can move at full speed. And that's what we talk about. Like when you think of a guy like Tyreek Hill, in-game GPS type stuff, the guy plays the game at a different speed. Can you play the game at that speed? Or if you run the 4.2 in the 40-yard dash like John Ross, but you can't play the game that fast, your speed really doesn't matter. You're not going to get bubble screens every single time the ball is snapped. So I think it's a valid concern, but I think when you watch him play, you kind of see it get erased. Now, I think one of the other concerns that gets brought up pretty frequently was his production against top competition a concern? And I think this is where, okay, people will say this moving the goalpost a little bit, but I think it's worth acknowledging, like, who else are you throwing the ball to in that Illinois offense? Who else is getting the ball? And I'm not saying they don't have anybody else that has draftable qualities, but I think Pat Bryant was pretty clear their top receiver. And so if a good college defense is trying to take away that top guy, I mean, what are you expecting? It's not CD Lamb out there, right? So I mean, it's just it's difficult for guys to get things going when you don't have a quarterback that can throw you open all the time.
Well, I was going to say Pat Bryant was their number one receiver in terms of overall yards. The second guy was Zachary Franklin, who had 55 catches for 652 yards. So he had one more catch than Pat, but Pat had obviously close to 300 more yards, obviously more touchdowns. So really it was just one other guy in the mix there. Hank Beatty was the other guy. He had 20 catches for 294. So really, when you talk about overall volume, it wasn't even close. Pat Bryant was wide receiver one here for this Illinois team, and it wasn't even close.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying is that, you know, people are moving the goalposts on both sides of these arguments, aren't they, Cody? It's like, okay, well, he didn't do well against top competition. Well, he's the only guy that they had to go up against, you know? Well, he's slow. He can't beat press coverage. Well, he ran fast on the in-game GPS. I mean, it's this back and forth that's like, you're right. Let's just see this guy, what he can do against these wide receivers they're not going to get any better competition than what they face every day in practice, are they? I mean, Going up against that Denver secondary, you're going to find out real quick if this guy has chops in the NFL. And I think it's going to take time, just like it does with every rookie receiver. But man, you're going to see pretty quickly if his play speed is as legit as maybe the Broncos thought going into this draft.
I think that's going to be an important thing too, right? How do you factor into the equation? Now, I'll say this, Sarah, it's crazy to think about this. Just a few years ago, the Los Angeles Rams, this was Sean Payton's first year in Denver. And I remember that joint training camp practice, man, I've never seen Sean Payton so pissed. And we even got an article after it all happened where he had to go in and he had to light some candles, burn some incense to get like the negative energy around, because they got their butts kicked by the Rams in that joint practice. I remember it clear as day. But I remember this is where we saw Puka Nacua really emerge. I was sitting there because Cooper Kupp was kind of banged up and wasn't really doing much in terms of team stuff. And I'm like, wait, who's this? Who's this guy over here that's running routes against Pat Surtain? Wow, this guy just made a great catch. Okay, who's this guy? Nobody knew who Puka Nacua was at that point, Sarah. And, I'm hoping, and I'm not trying to say that Pat Bryant's going to be the next Puka Nacua, but I'm hoping when we get in some of these practices, we start seeing this guy work. It's like, oh, who is this guy? Like, where did he come from? That's what happened last year with Devon Bailey. Devon Bailey was working. He was one hand catching, passes against PJ Locke and the Broncos secondary. And I was like, wait a minute, who's this Bailey kid? This is what we want to see here from Pat Bryant. Like, what type of impact can he have right away? When he steps on the field against this elite level secondary that has Pat, that has now Jade Barron added to the mix, Jaquan McMillan, Riley Moss, Talanoa Hufanga, and Brandon Jones at safety. Drake Greenlaw, we ain't going to see him on the field probably till training camp. But it's like, how does this guy do when he gets on the field against these guys? That is what I think I'm going to be most looking forward to. And I think we'll have a little bit of an evaluation, maybe what he can do once that moment happens. But right now, really until then, it's a lot of, hey, what does this look like on paper? Another thing too, that's mentioned here, he doesn't have much special teams work. Obviously, being the top guy at Illinois, you're not going to be playing wide receiver as your top thing, and then you're going to be going and playing jammer or gunner on special teams. But here at the NFL level, because Denver has such a deep wide receiver room right now, he is going to have to acclimate himself a tiny bit here on special teams. I don't think it's not as a core four, but we may see him as a gunner. I think same thing with Devon Bailey. These guys might play some gunner here for the Broncos this upcoming season.
They've got to. We didn't see either of those guys really play special teams last year, Vele or Franklin, and certainly Cortland Sutton doesn't play special teams. And so it's going to be fascinating to see. That's when we talk about some of these sleepers on the team at receiver. I think Trent Sherfield, although he's not going to be playing a big role offensively, he's going to be a tough guy to beat for a roster spot because these guys are going to have to prove they can be better than him on special teams. Interesting, quick little factoid on Sherfield, Cody. I looked up his contract. 2-year, $6 million deal, only $1.5 million guaranteed. So the Broncos are kind of almost begging for somebody to come take his roster spot and play some special teams. I looked this up while you were talking because you mentioned the guys for the Rams. Get a load of this, okay? Get a load of this, okay? Cooper Kupp, RAS score of 5.0 and a 40-yard dash time of 4.62 with a vertical jump of 31 inches, broad jump in the 35th percentile. Terrible testing numbers for Cooper Kupp. Puka Nacua, a RAS of 5.17, 4.56 in the 40-yard dash, 33-inch vertical jump. I mean, and he tested below the 40th percentile in the shuttle, below the 20th percentile in 3-cone, and below the 40th percentile in 10-yard split. That's something that Pat Bryant has to his advantage, is a 1.56 in the 10-yard split, which is up there amongst up in the 80th, I think, or 85th percentile overall in terms of that position group. So when you talk about athletic traits and explosiveness, they come in many different forms, right? There's some guys that are, they say, quicker than fast. That's typically the smaller, slower slot receivers who are quicker than fast. They can get open in a short area. Pat Bryant has explosiveness to him. He doesn't necessarily have, he ain't going to win you the 200-meter dash, right? But he can go out there and he can create after the catch. He can create with after contact, things like that. So I found it interesting. You brought up those Rams guys, and they both stunk in the pre-draft process in terms of athletic testing, but certainly they play fast, and that's helped them, I guess, become wide receiver ones in the NFL.
I think Pat Bryant had 37.5-inch vertical, if I'm not mistaken. But here's something too, like, let's go back to Puka here, right? All those things, when you look at like a 10-yard split, right? You think about a guy's ability to move quickly in space or change transition directions. Look how much he's evolved in his career, because this was in the wild card round of the playoffs. He was Puka Nacua is targeted on 39.8% of his routes and averaged 3.7 yards per route after returning from injury in week 8, both of which were the highest marks among wide receivers with 150 routes during that span. Among those receivers, CeeDee Lamb had the next highest target rate during that span at 32.9, which was a mark 6.9% lower than Nacua's. So you're telling me, like, even though these guys run slow 40-yard dashes, but they can move well across the field where the game is actually played. The widespread portion of the game is played in the short to intermediate, and then you could do the rest. That's where Pat Bryant excels. And I'm not saying he's going to be the next Cooper Kupp or the next Puka Nacua by any means, but I'm saying he's got the athletic traits and he's got the physical tools that the Broncos have seen on tape that you're like, wow, this guy might be a little bit of a gem, and we're going to take a chance on him here in the third round because our wide receiver room, we like that room. We've acknowledged that since the Super Bowl. This guy can come in and shake things up a little bit. I'm excited to see if that's going to be the case there. There's a lot to watch here for the Broncos. Obviously, his rookie minicamp comes up this week. Mandatory minicamp, OTAs, training camp, all that stuff. You can get coverage here, Locked On Broncos, every step of the way as we highlight and look at all of these players. But with that said, Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show of our Rookie Profile Series. Tomorrow, we're going to be taking a look at Savion Jones. The Broncos might have a guy who's going to be a plug-and-play fit behind Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers, alongside Jordan Jackson right away as a rookie. What did the tape tell us about him? We'll highlight strengths, weaknesses, and more on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.